Hi, and welcome to this demo on getting started with a generative AI gateway, specifically looking at the LiteLLM Gateway. So first things first, in case you haven't come across this, what is a generative AI gateway? The whole point here is that we have a centralized proxy service that acts as an interface between your development teams and applications wanting to utilize generative AI models, and then all the different model providers that they might be reaching out to. So as your scale and use of Gen AI grows across your organization, you're probably going to have lots of different teams, lots of different users, all developing their own applications using different models from different providers. Of course, they can all integrate directly, but having a centralized service means that you can gain management and monitoring and governance capabilities over these interactions. You can set things like team-based restrictions, restricting different users and teams to different models, and managing their cost and usage. Some of the typical components of a generative AI gateway include a unified interface. This means that you get the same open AI SDK type interface over a whole host of different model providers. This means that as model performance changes, which we know it's going to continue to do, you can easily switch between the different models and the different providers so that you can keep up with the latest and best performance. You'll have a centralized layer where you can perform management, monitoring, and security type operations. You'll be able to set budgets to do things like cost tracking and budget enforcement, and also look at cost optimization methods like prompt caching. And then finally, you can utilize your generative AI gateway for things like routing logic, where you might switch between providers if one is not available, or have fallback mechanisms for things like context window overflow. So why is all this useful and valuable? Well, I've mentioned a few already, but principally it's giving you flexibility. So we're free to utilize multiple models and multiple providers without having to change our code each time to be specific to that particular model or provider. We can also utilize that centralized management to allow governance at scale. So without a gateway, you have lots of teams, each interacting directly with models and providers with no centralized governance in place. A gateway allows you to do this so that you can safely adopt generative AI. So for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to be using this GitHub project, which gives a reference deployment of the LiteLLM Gateway on AWS. Now, the solution has made a few additions on top of the LiteLLM. So there's the open source LiteLLM gateway deployed here. And there's also an API middleware layer that allows us to use some of the Boto 3 features to integrate with our different models. So if you've written a lot of code using the Boto 3 SDK already, this solution is going to help you carry on using that code. And then a lot of the supporting services for the gateway have been deployed via AWS managed services too. So if you want to, you can see this solution via this link or the QR code. So you can see here, I've come across to the solutions library on GitHub. I've gone to the guidance for multi-provider generative AI gateway on AWS, and we're going to start by cloning this project. Once we have the project cloned, you can open it up in your IDE, and you can start to configure. There's an environment template here. You can use this to set environment variables for your deployment. This could include setting different API keys for the different model providers that you might have available to you. You can use a Route 53 hosted zone for your custom domain endpoints. And there's some settings around whether you want the load balancer to be internet facing or not. I'm going to keep this as true for now, just for simplicity in terms of connection, but you should consider the deployment that you want. Once the deployment has finished, you should be able to go to your load balancer address and with the /UI access the LiteLLM login page. From here, you can enter the credentials, which for this deployment, the username will be admin, and you can get the password from Secrets Manager. Once logged in, you can see the LiteLLM admin interface. And from here, we can use things like virtual keys, so we can create different keys for different users and teams, and then associate different permission sets and track usage at the key level. I can test different keys direct in the console here. So in my current UI session, I can pick a model, and we can test that the key is set up correctly to access this model. And we can also switch between different models, which shows the integration with the different model providers. From there, we can then also view a catalog of the models that we have available to us. So you can see so far I have the different Bedrock models. This is because I've deployed into my AWS account in the London region, and these are the Bedrock models that I have granted access to that particular account. And I've also configured these in my LiteLLM config file deployment. So now I can use the gateway to access all of these different Bedrock hosted models. I can then start to track usage as I do so. But let's say, for example, that we want to also add a model for a different provider, in this case, Azure OpenAI. So I go across to my Azure portal, and you can see that I've created a GenAI Gateway deployment here. So if I go through to the Azure Foundry and I select my deployments, you see that I have this GPT-4 deployment, which is my OpenAI model deployed on an Azure OpenAI endpoint that I also now want to integrate with my GenAI Gateway. So in order to do this, back in my config.yaml file in the solution, so you can see I have all my existing Bedrock models added in this config. So now I'm going to add the one for the Azure GPT-4 deployment. In order to do that, I add some LiteLLM params. I'm going to specify the API version, the API base, which is the URL to my deployment. And I'm also saying that I've added the Azure Open API key as an environment variable. So if you remember back in the .env file, you'll have set an Azure Open API key here rather than this being a placeholder. Once done, I can save this file and I can use the helper script to update. This will trigger a new deployment. Back in the models UI, you can see that we now have the Azure model also listed. And if I click onto it, you can see the details set around that. So again, if we now wanted to test that that's working, you can see that we are now getting the answer from the Azure GPT-4 model. So very quickly, we can integrate these different models from different providers and use the centralized LiteLLM proxy to open up access to these models and providers, but then also starting to track the usage. So you'll see now we haven't put much usage through the gateway yet, but you can see that we'll be able to track this at the API key level, at the provider level, and we can see which models and which teams are using which models. So for example, now I might create a team. I'm not going to set an organization for now, and I might say that I want them to have access to either the GPT-4 model, or maybe if they're doing some A/B testing, I might also want to give access to the Claude 3 Sonnet model. I could do things like set budgets, say how often I want the budget to reset, and also apply restrictions on the number of tokens per minute they can use or the number of requests per minute they can use. For now, though, I'm just going to restrict access to these two particular models and create the team. I can then also create virtual key for this team now. So I can come in here, select my dev team, and I can give it a name. And again, I'm just going to say here, rather than applying specific model restrictions, I'm going to say that they can have all access to all the models that the team has access to, and we'll create the key. Now imagine that my development team are working on building an application. So I've come here to a Jupyter Lab environment just to simulate that experience. And I've configured my environment with variables to reference my team's API key. So the virtual key that we just created for the development team, I've taken that API key and I'm pointing to our LiteLLM endpoint. With this sample solution from the AWS Solutions Library, we can use the OpenAI SDK. So you can see again, I've got some environment variables to reference my LiteLLM proxy. I've specified that I want to use the Claude 3 model that I have access to with the API key that I'm using here. And then I can issue those prompts just as you would expect. So we can see we get back saying that I'm an AI model called Claude created by Anthropic. And if as part of that application development, you might want to test to switch to Azure and the OpenAI model that we deployed, it's as simple as changing the model ID here. Everything else can stay the same. So this helps give you that flexibility while still maintaining the centralized governance. So now I've switched out to Azure GPT-4, and again, I get my response back saying, hello, I'm a model developed by OpenAI. You can also, with this solution, use the Boto 3 interface. They've added a middleware layer to allow you to do that. And again, it's as you would expect. You can make calls. Here, again, I'm passing the Azure GPT-4 and I'm asking for a list of 3 pop songs. And we get our response back from the model. So again, if you had existing Boto 3 code, you could swap this out to use the LiteLLM Gateway. Back in the LiteLLM console, you'll now be able to start monitoring the usage of these keys by the different teams. So for example, here already, whilst we've not made many requests, we can see that on the virtual keys, our dev team has spent this amount so far. And we can explore the usage further to start looking at how this tracks over time across the different API keys that we have created, the different models that we have access to, looking at the split between different providers, and exploring the logs as they come in across the different teams that might be using the gateway and all the different models and providers that they have access to. So thank you for watching. I hope that's been useful in helping you to get started with a generative AI gateway.